colleagues, today we are very fortunate to have Alessio from the European Commission. He has just authored a book, Growth for Good, and I've read that book. It's a brilliant book. He'll probably tell us how the idea of the book came, which is also a great idea. And I wish many other young authors like him venture into writing. To chair the session today and an important issue, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, Chairman for the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare. As you know, that the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare is a policy-oriented research think tank in NCAR area, and we have been doing this webinars for nearly 2 years now. Our objective is to touch and discuss various policy issues. We have been very fortunate to have two Nobel laureates speak to us, and we have tried to maintain a 50-50 balance. 50% of speakers are from India, and 50% of speakers are from various universities across the world, including Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, Berkeley. It is in that very context that we have the speaker today from the European Commission. To chair the session, Dr. Virmani, we are requesting Dr. Virmani to chair it. As you know, Dr. Virmani himself is a scholar and a researcher. He has been the chief economic advisor of our country, and then he was the executive director at the IMF from 2009 to 2012. He has spent long years in the Planning Commission, and before that, he was in the World Bank. He has authored two very good books, and he has published in various refereed journals. His areas of expertise are, of course, strategy, planning, geopolitics, and fiscal issues. He was the chief economic advisor of our country. With this, I hand over to Dr. Arvind Virmani to take the session further. Dr. Virmani, please.
Thank you. So let me start by introducing our speaker. Of course, Sharon already mentioned that your book is Growth for Good, and growth is kind of one of the important areas of our research, of my research, and stuff we do at the EGROW Foundation. But very quickly, for our listeners, Alessio Terzi, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, is an economist at the European Commission and a lecturer at Sciences Po Lille, which is a well-known university in Europe. And it's good that we are having people from Europe. We have, of course, much greater connections with USA. So we have a lot more people from there. It's good to have, I think, more people from Europe to speak to us. So he was a fellow at Bruegel, leading European economics think tank, and a Fulbright scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has also worked in the European Central Bank, and he obtained his PhD from Terzi School with a thesis on economic growth. So I look forward to a lot more interaction on growth aspects, I'm sure, even beyond your book. Of course, we look forward to what your subject of your talk, but maybe we will also get your knowledge and information on other aspects of growth which have become prominent in Europe over the last 5 to 10 years. With that, over to you.
Very much. Let me try and share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Good. All right. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks a lot for the kind words already on the book. I'm glad some of you have read it already. And I'm extremely delighted to be here, in part because of what you were saying as well, which is that perhaps these exchanges, these intellectual interactions on topics that are of common interest are fruitful, useful, and don't happen often enough. And so I'm glad to be in this setting, talking to a different audience that I'm sure cares about growth, but cares also about the future of the planet more broadly. And so how to reconcile the two. I'm hearing some background noise.
Listeners, please mute yourself. Anybody who's listening, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Good. So let's get going with the presentation. Of course, just a little reminder that I do work at the European Commission, but of course, the book is something I have done in my own time, let's say, and doesn't represent necessarily the institutional view, but it's more a discussion that we're going to have on these topics. So the book, this is the book. It came out indeed. These are I've just copy pasted actually the information out of the Harvard University Press catalog. Not so much to tell you what the price of the book is in 3 different currencies, but more to show that it is a book that is recent. It came out just shortly before the summer. It is a trade book, which in the language of publishers means that it is a book written for a wide audience. It is not a technical book or a technical macroeconomics book that requires deep knowledge or understanding of economics to be handled. And actually, most of the details are pushed into the let's say in the end notes. So there's a long session at the end of end notes which contain all the references to the papers or the more technical discussions, and you can see that there for those of you that are more. What have I done? Well, let's see if I okay. For those of us that are more technical. It was mentioned at the beginning that perhaps I would have given a few elements of the genesis of this book. Indeed, this book is very much a pandemic product. It is a book that was brought to life. Fine. It's a book. What is happening? Sorry. I constantly receive a request to annotate slides from Karnati.
We are seeing a slide which says Genesis.
Yes. It's just that I receive a request to annotate the slides from Karnati, and I lose control of the slides if I allow somebody to annotate on them. So I have to decline these. Okay, now for the moment we're good. So I was saying that it's important for me to mention a bit the genesis of this book, which is very much a pandemic product. It's a book that was thought of in the early phases of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, as you might remember, especially at the beginning of this whole saga. The way this sort of played out, particularly in advanced economies, was a new virus came to life, let's say, and because it was new, it wasn't clear what we could do. There were no vaccines, there was no treatment, and so governments across the world rushed to put in place lockdown measures stay-at-home orders. They had different names, let's say. And everything was going bad. And so, you know, the health situation was bad. The economies around the world started tanking because consumption started tanking. And for those that were looking for a silver lining, perhaps the only silver lining was that a set of environmental indicators started to improve. And so, you know, the quality of the air started to improve. The quality of water started to improve. The CO2 emissions dropped at the fastest clip, actually, since World War II at global level. And at some point, even there were pictures that were going around on social media showing dolphins in Venice's canals. Now, this was an exaggeration. These pictures proved to be fabricated, and there were no dolphins in Venice's canals. But if there is one thing that sort of stuck with me, or the reflection that started, was, could it be, even once the pandemic is long gone, even once these stay-at-home orders are no longer necessary for health reasons, could it be that the economy and nature are at odds, and therefore that because we have to reduce the pressure on nature, we should consider among the policy options also curtailing the economy? And that's a bit how the reflection of the book started. So it is a reflection that is on the link between the economy, but then rapidly it arrives at the concept of economic growth and nature. So the bottom side of this slide. And as soon as you start reflecting on these issues, it sort of becomes irremediable to add an extra layer, which is the system we live in, or the economic system we live in, which is capitalism. And this creates a sort of holy trinity or unholy trinity, depending on where you stand, which connects three aspects. So capitalism, economic growth, and nature. And that's what the book is all about in a nutshell. Really, if I had to boil it down to one slide, the book is about explaining, understanding, exploring the interactions between these three elements. So growth and nature, growth and capitalism. So is it that capitalism forces a necessity for growth or not, or the two are, they can be, let's say, separated? Can capitalism become green, as a lot of the policy talk goes, or is in a way are the forces of capitalism destroying nature, and therefore this is a force or a system that is impossible to reconcile with a need to alleviate pressure on planet Earth? This type of reflection is gaining a lot of ground among certain groups, particularly in certain countries, particularly in certain groups. So it is, let's say, a questioning of economic growth, or the use of economic growth, or the usefulness of economic growth, is particularly affecting younger generations in rich countries, in rich economies, in Europe, in the United States, and beyond. And I argue in the book that this is probably for a variety of reasons. The first being that, let's say, my generation and beyond, so millennials and Generation Z, and so the younger generation than mine, have seen relatively limited economic growth in rich economies. I think of my own, and that's what this graph on the left tries to show. This is cumulative GDP growth experienced by different generations in US history. So it's a chart for the United States. And what it aims to show is that over the first 15 years of their working life, effectively millennials have seen the least cumulative economic growth than any generation before them in US history. And if we go beyond raw data and I look at my own experience, I graduated from undergraduate, let's say shortly after, around the time of Lehman Brothers, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the great financial crisis. After that, for the European, in Europe, let's say there was the Eurozone crisis. After that, there was secular stagnation, so very limited rebound in growth. After that, there was the COVID-19 shock, which I was talking about earlier, and now there is the shock connected to the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis. And so it feels like growth is always on the other side of the corner, but mine and the one below is a generation that has seen sort of very little of this economic growth. And on top of that, this has come hand in hand with rising inequalities, particularly in certain countries more than others. Of course, there's the work of Thomas Piketty, which is pictured on the top right of this slide, who has been showing that economic growth in the United States has been partnered with, since the 1980s, with widening inequalities, income inequalities, wealth inequalities. So the argument sort of goes, we haven't seen that much growth. When we've seen it, it has been pocketed by the top 1%, the top 0.1%, large corporations, and so on. There's different ways of looking at this problem. And on top of that, historically, so over the long term, economic growth and CO2 emissions have been going hand in hand. Industrialization, since there has been industrialization over the past 150 to 100 years, we have seen, of course, CO2 emissions rising exponentially. And so an increasing environmental awareness of this generation is leading to an overall critique or questioning of the usefulness of further growth. And this is something that The Economist a few years back has called the rise of millennial socialism. The first part of the book, going back to my trilemma or my unholy trinity, looks at this nexus. So the nexus between capitalism and growth. It is a bit more of an economic reflection, but again, with no excessively technical jargon. And what I try to show there, trying to pick a compact definition of capitalism, looking at what unites, of course, different models across the world, and the really boiling it down to the core elements of a capitalistic model. And what I try to conclude is that indeed, in the way capitalism is structured, because of, let's say, the competition between firms trying to maximize profits and so on, there are some elements of the system that sort of rekindle a constant desire for growth based on the current preferences of consumers. And so up until now, this is not something that I take a value judgment on, but what I try to conclude, or an implication of this, is that to just drop out there let's say, as a policy recommendation to abolish growth or to ditch economic growth is not something that you can just add to a long list of, policy suggestions. It's like, we should build more solar and wind energy capacity, we should reduce inequalities, and by the way, we also have to ditch economic growth. You have to be careful, because what you're saying effectively, because capitalism and growth are closely intertwined, what you're recommending is in a way to surpass the current economic system. And so you have to be ready to provide a blueprint of an alternative economic system if you are suggesting that certain countries should get rid of economic growth altogether. While I was working on this book, and I've taken a very open-minded approach, as in, it's not like I started writing this book because I was on a crusade to defend capitalism or defend economic growth. I was genuinely interested in understanding more about these topics. And so I read everything I could, even beyond economics, surely beyond mainstream economics, so also venturing into unorthodox sides of my discipline. And indeed, there is a literature. It's called at times degrowth literature. It is called at times steady state economics. It is called at times eco-socialism. So there are thinkers, writers that do do indeed identify the nexus that I was talking about between capitalism and growth. And what they say is, indeed, we have to get rid of growth, therefore we have to get rid of capitalism. And what we should focus on is nature. And in a way, you have to preserve nature, and sure, this will result in some scarcity, but this is voluntary scarcity. This is scarcity that should be embraced based on a principle of sufficiency, that people have enough, and so that they should embrace this as a positive development and share what is left peacefully. And furthermore, type of policy conclusions that come from this type of literature, which of course is very targeted to rich countries. So let me be clear, this type of literature says this is a recommendation for rich countries, and actually they should shrink their economy so that this opens up space for emerging markets, for poorer nations, for least developed countries to develop and provide for, of course, for the poor. Of course, some of the recommendations are to say we should continue innovation or research and development, but this should be very much centralized. It shouldn't be left to the devices of private companies to decide on what they want to invest in innovation. And it further goes into saying, you should embrace a lifestyle of sufficiency. I was mentioning it before, produce locally, and so on and so forth. Now, and in the book, again, I try to present these recommendations as they are. So one chapter of the book is really to present an alternative view of how the climate challenge should be managed. But the book comes eventually to different conclusions. So growth for good, the G for G, comes to different conclusions in the sense that what I say is, if we were to embrace a steady state economy, rather than a world as depicted or as imagined by some of these, let's say, utopian to a certain extent thinkers, rather than having people share what is left happily, reconciling nations and reconciling groups in society, actually what is likely to happen is that this would exacerbate tensions between groups in society and between societies over limited resources. And again, to make this argument, I try to borrow from economic history, from a variety of literatures, from sociology, from social psychology. I really, as I said, I took an open mind also in terms of the literature I was borrowing from. And I come to the conclusion that this is because the growth imperative, or this constant rekindling of growth, is not an imposition of the system, be it capitalism, on people who are otherwise indifferent, but rather it is something that people have, to a certain extent, I would argue, inbuilt in them. So this a desire for more, for better, which ultimately, to a certain extent, if we look at the long arc of human history, is what brought us from being a middle-sized mammal and being 8 million people on this planet to the top of the food chain, because we've used ingenuity, technology, know-how led by a desire for better and for more, and so to address problems as they came, be it the availability of food, be it the availability of housing, be it the challenge that came with pestilence, with pandemics, and so on and so forth.
Requesting everybody, please
mute,
mute your mics. Please mute your mics.
One point I tried to make in the book, but again, I don't want to go too much into the details of this.
Dr. K. Kanakaratnam, please mute your mic.
One point I tried to make in the book, but that is, let's say, a broader discussion on economic history, is that, of course, the capitalism, the capitalistic system, is not is this idea of the link between innovation and economic growth. And what I try to say there is, look, there has been great work by economic historians of the caliber of Joël Mokyr and others that show that effectively what happened around the Industrial Revolution was indeed a shift in economic growth model. And it was a shift from what he calls a Smithian growth model, one that is based on the division of labor. We can think of the pin factory in Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, a model that is based mostly on gains from trade and so on, to a model that is instead innovation-led. He calls it Schumpeterian cumulative knowledge growth model. So a model that effectively has innovation as its central element, and it is innovation that is driving growth. And because growth, the ensuing growth makes more resources available, these can then be reinserted into the innovation machinery, and this generates the exponential pattern that we have seen since the Industrial Revolution. This is a bit what the chart on the left, probably you cannot see the axis, but what this chart tries to show is that the richer you are, let's say, richer countries have also a higher propensity for innovation, but simply because they have more resources to invest in the innovation machinery. And what I try to argue there is that capitalism, in this whole narrative that I've given you, is, for good or for bad, it surely has many problems. It has issues that need to be contained and so on. But if there is one element that it is good at, is that it is an efficient machinery at fostering innovation. And this is something that we are gonna direly need in order to avoid a climate catastrophe over the coming decades. And to make this point, I borrowed something from let's say from an article by Martin Wolf on the Financial Times a few years ago. He did really back of the envelope calculations, which are shown here. And the way to read this chart is what Martin Wolf was saying is, okay, let's assume at the global level that there's going to be no economic growth between now and mid-century. And so we cap the economy between now and mid-century. If we were to do that, and the pace of innovation, of green innovation, or the pace of decarbonization were to continue at the pace we have seen it on average over the past few decades, by 2050 emissions would be down by roughly 40%, which obviously is very far from net zero or climate neutrality, which is what climate scientists tell us we should aim at in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And so the implications of this are twofold. Either what you're saying is that we cannot just pursue a steady state economy at the global level. We should actually decrease the size of the economy at the global level. And if we take, let's say, the degrowth narrative, and so we will focus only on a limited set of countries, on rich countries, the numbers you're talking about are huge. You're talking about something like a reduction in income levels of around 60%. And I'm taking this from the work of one of the degrowth economists, so I'm not even making these numbers up to scare anybody, which obviously is something that is very unlikely from a political standpoint to be ever implemented. Or the alternative is that you have to accelerate immensely the pace of the rollout of green technologies, which I would argue is a much more promising avenue in order to achieve climate neutrality. While I'm at it, it's worth mentioning that I sort of told you that innovation and growth are two sides of the same coin to me, especially, I mean, I'm talking long term. I'm not talking about what happens in the second quarter of 2021 or 2022. I'm talking about the long-term economic growth trends. And what I try to say there in the book is that innovation and growth are actually the same thing. And then when you approach it, at least at an abstract level, And when you approach it in that way, there's nothing intrinsic in the definition of economic growth per se that says the only way to achieve it is to burn fossil fuel, to destroy the planet, to extract constantly raw material, and so on. This might be the current type of economic growth model, but it doesn't have to be the only one, and it's not intrinsic in the definition of economic growth. And so the implication of this is that a different or a reshaped type of growth, if I'm borrowing from the subtitle of my book, is needed in order to face this challenge. The overarching conclusion that I try to reach is that avoiding a climate disaster goes through a restructuring of the economy, a broad restructuring of the economy, and a switch to green technology, and that in this, capitalism could be a forceful ally because it has proven time and again a strong machinery to foster innovation. And in particular, not only the development of innovation that it's not necessarily what capitalism has been an outlier for, but the deployment of this green technology by firms that are competing for attention by consumers. And finally, I wouldn't want to, if I were to stop at this, it would sound like I'm just saying, you know, capitalism is going to solve all our problems, and so we don't have to do anything. We just wait for the machinery to take care of this. And this is not the conclusion I would want you to take away from this presentation, nor my book, because these things don't happen on their own, and capitalism is a system that is organized around the price mechanism and prices, and so you will have to intervene in order to reorient this machinery and enroll it in the fight against climate change, or to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. Particularly given we're doing this against a timeline. And so we need to achieve this complete restructuring of economies at a very fast pace. When I give these talks in Brussels, in Washington, of course, the focus has been very much on policy. So what governments can do, the policies that can be put in place. There's a classic that economists love, which is carbon pricing, and there is indeed a discussion on carbon pricing in the book. There is a discussion on regulation and so on and so forth. But the book doesn't stop at that. So what I try to say is there is surely a lot that governments can do, but it does not stop at that. And because of the scale, the speed, and the size of this transformation, we also need the help of all actors in society. And there are sections on what businesses can do. And there are sections crucially about what citizens, which are also consumers, can do. And what I have in mind is more of a whole of nation approach to this problem, and not something that can be solved by one single actor or one single group of actors in society. Just one point, I told you that this is going to be a transformation, a complete transformation in the economy. And I don't think this comes across enough in the public discourse, although there's many authors, writers. Nicholas Stern has been saying this for now over 20 years, so I don't pretend that I've discovered anything. But my impression is that even the general public, and often politicians or public policy experts, don't realize that the scale we're talking about, if you need to reach climate neutrality or net zero, it means that basically everything needs to be reinvented. The production of everything, production, consumption, transport, housing, agriculture, every single aspect of these needs to be reinvented or re-engineered because of just how pervasive fossil fuels have been in our technology or in civilization over the past 200 years. What this means is that, and again, the book tries to take very much a historical angle, but what I try to say is probably the parallels when we try to understand what is about to happen are closer met when we look at what happened during past industrial revolutions, because this is the scale of the transformation that we're talking about. And when we look at that, there has been, or there will be, I would argue, a complete recasting of competitive advantages across countries, across the globe, and let's say between firms across the globe, and companies or countries that are, there are some that will emerge as winners because they are pioneers in these new technologies, in these new production methods. They will invent new ways of doing things that are cheap, efficient, and effective. And there are others that will remain stuck in old technologies, in technologies that are perceived as being old and lower quality. One aspect, and we're approaching the close of my talk, but one aspect that has received quite a bit of attention in the book, also in a review that was written by Barry Eichengreen of Berkeley University for Foreign Affairs, is he liked that the book tries to treat, I started the talk with, let's say, this inequality and environmental awareness parallel, and the book keeps this double-tracked discussion proceeding throughout it. And the point I try to make there is, effectively, I told you that this is something that resembles a complete transformation of the economy. And on top of that, we will be using policy tools to make it even faster, because we're trying to do that against a timeline that is set by climate science. And we know, again, from the history of technological revolutions and innovation waves more broadly, that when that happens, some groups of society, some areas, some regions, some professions are at risk of being left behind. And actually, there's a great book by Kalestus Juma, who was a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. And this is the only book I will mention in this presentation, aside from my own. But it's a great book because he goes through the history of innovation waves throughout, different civilizations, different moments in times. He looks at the printing press and the Ottoman Empire, and why innovation didn't spread in that case to the Ottoman Empire, and there was resistance, and why it did in other parts of the world. And he does the same for a variety of technologies. And what he says is, if you leave some groups behind, if some groups think or feel, it doesn't even have to be real, but if they feel they're being left behind, they will oppose the technology, they will oppose the innovation, and you will not be able to do it. And so there are some social limits, rather than the technological side, which is complex, it is difficult, but there are some, let's say, social concerns that must be addressed in parallel while you're doing this green transformation. So inclusive policies and keeping society together while you're pushing ahead for this transformation must go hand in hand. There is much more in the book. There is part of the title comes from this idea that growth is, what is growth? And growth is a force, potentially a force for good. And if it has been, and if it is not, it can return to be one again, in the sense of contributing to well-being, in the sense of contributing to the green transformation, in the sense of shoring up liberal democracies. So there is a discussion on the interplay between, let's say, democracy and its strength and economic growth. The book is, I know that I've given you a very abstract talk, but the book is also very practical, and the reflecting a bit my double personality, because I teach at university, but I'm also active in policy. And so there are some sections that are very practical, actually. There is one section that is a case study, and it's a zoom in on Italy, taken as an example of what happens when a country, effectively, if a rich country enters a steady state economy. And Italy is a country that hasn't seen real economic growth basically over the past 30 years. And so it shows all the toxic dynamics that are unleashed. Even if the country remains wealthy, remains a member of the G7, of the G20, of the OECD, and so on, and by global standards, it is a rich country, still you're exposed to some toxic dynamics. There is a chapter on international cooperation, and I think this is perhaps something you'll be interested in, because in a way, I've given you a talk, and the book is very much targeted to, let's say, a developed country setting, mostly because the critiques that I was mentioning to the concept of growth are coming from scholars, thinkers, activists in the rich part of the world. And so that's why a lot of the book is targeted to that audience. But of course, climate change is a global challenge, and therefore there is a section that tries to put this into a broader perspective of how this would play out and what the consequences are, and also on what international cooperation, what is credible international cooperation in the face of climate change. And finally, there's a chapter on green, what gets called green macro. And the argument there is, if we were to do all these things that I've mentioned to you we should be doing, all these policies, all these actions, and so on, what would happen? Could it be that this just spells the end of economic growth, and that effectively you're just substituting, you know, an internal combustion engine car for the electric vehicle, but at the end you're getting the same thing out of it, and so this is not generating growth. You're just, okay, switching from the polluting option to the green option, but that doesn't necessarily foster growth. And there I take a much more, let's say, a position where I argue that actually will foster economic growth. And you could get to this point given I was talking to you about an industrial revolution type of mindset. This brings me to the last and final slide, which has some important, I believe, policy implications. The first, which is more targeted, again, to countries that are richer, let's say, which is to say, I often receive the other side of the coin, let's say, as a negative argument, which is, you know, especially Europe. Europe is a small set of countries when you look at CO2 emissions globally. We're talking about 8 to 10% of CO2 emissions. Therefore, we are spending so much money, we're doing all these investments to green our economy, but at the end of the day, it will not matter, or it will not affect the trend of global warming if other countries don't follow suit. And so why are we doing this? And of course, you can make a moral argument for this, and there is an ethical argument to be made. But what I try to say is there is something that goes beyond this, which is what you're trying to do. And the reason why it makes sense is that these technologies are arriving, the transformation is inevitable because the alternative is climate catastrophe. And if you assume that the transformation is inevitable, you want to be at the forefront of this transformation. You want to be a pioneer because by doing so, you're effectively locking in a comparative advantage in some of these technologies, which is what I was talking to you about before. The second point is when this is expected to happen, it's very unlikely that governments are just going to sit back, relax across the globe. It's very unlikely that governments are just going to take a standoff approach and wait and see on which side of the fence they fall, whether their country has a competitive advantage in some of the new technologies or not. And rather, because we're at this cusp moment in economic history, this sort of generates all sorts of incentives for countries to engage in industrial policy tools, in trade clauses, in carbon border tax type of policies, and so on, in order to push initially for innovation as well, but that takes place in their countries and not only elsewhere. And the final point that perhaps is of greater interest to this audience is a point on emerging markets, because the other side of the coin of what I was spelling out for the first point is that I hear a lot when giving this talk to friends or policy experts in emerging markets is, or at least even more so in least developed countries, they say, you know, yes, in principle, all you say is right, but we need to focus on development because we have a lot of people who are extremely poor, and we need to focus on development. And this green thing is something that we can focus on later on. And it's something that rich countries can go ahead with, but we're going to focus on this later on. And what I argue there is be careful, because I believe that the path for polluting development is closing, and is closing fast. And that actually these green technologies that sound like an obsession of the rich world are actually walking down cost curves very rapidly, also as a result of big investments in them. And that rapidly within years, we're not talking about decades, but within years, some of these technologies will become the cheap option. And so the green option and the cheap option will coincide. And at that point, the risk is that if you invest in like in trying to develop a comparative advantage in fossil fuel technologies, you end up being locked into technologies that are old, that are poorly exportable, in part also because consumer preferences are shifting. And so you end up with something that is costlier and not very useful to achieve development. But I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on this, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of give a comment, a couple of comments, and I hope you have a pen or something, and you're free to respond to any of them or not. I mean, it's up to you. The first, I mean, they're kind of observations which are relevant to the issue, and particularly in the Indian context and the Indian audience. So it turns out that, you know, I've been listening to a podcast of the history of ancient India from roughly 600 BCE to 0 CE. And two very interesting things struck me, which kind of have relevance to your topic, by the way. That's why I'm telling the story. One of the amazing ones is, which really I did not know about, that during somewhere in the middle of this period where they have evidence, the business, the traders, there are two types of craft traders and kind of what you would probably call merchant traders, had guilds which were incredibly powerful. How do we know that? Because there are stories which talk about the head of the guild being kind of essential for the coronation of a king, for example. I mean, we know from traditionally, it is the kings who hold the sword, right? They are the powerful guys. But there are stories about the guild president had to be kind of present there. Otherwise, people would think there's something wrong with this king, this new king. Okay, so that's how powerful they were. I was shocked. And this is really trade. You know, this is the old economy in 350 BC or wherever. Okay. Now, why do I mention this? But both these kings and these were highly respectful of the Indian rishis and gurus who actually lived with nature. You know, that's how the thing comes in, your triangle. That there were lectures, there were monasteries, there were gurus who, in some sense, represented and they were respected. So we don't know the 100% details of this old stuff, but there is some evidence that at least in theory, the society tried to live or had an ideal of living with nature. So in some sense, you know, as far as India is concerned, you know, this is not a new idea. That's the point I'm making. And in some sense, we can be reminded of it, right? We may have forgotten. I had forgotten this history. I mean, just as a specific example, I had forgotten this history, or maybe I never learned it. So that's the first point that I think to Indians who have been, you know, not everything in the past was good. I'm not saying that. That's not the idea. Despite we all know victors write the history and all that. But I think there is a long tradition in India which is genuine of living in harmony with nature and having your polity. In the old days, the kings lived by the sword. So polity means something quite different now, but anyway. And your economy, you know, whatever economy there was, incredible craftsmen. I mean, there's reference to the textiles which were traded and exported all over the world. So that's the first point. So it's not something, in my view, which is alien to Indian culture or Indian history or Indians. So it should not be a very difficult, you know, as it might be in some other countries. The second issue or comment is starting from where you started. I'm starting from the ground level before I come to your broader big issues. The economics I learned was very straightforward. And what puzzles me is those simple economics. My thesis advisor was Arrow. So you can maybe guess the kind of things I'm going to talk about. Which, talking about it like, decades later sounds a bit simplistic, but I have not found, even the simplistic stuff in too much of the analysis which I have seen over the last 30 years from the West. And again, there's a point about this. So really, the economics of externalities and public goods, it's a simple concept, but it applies to environment, it applies to so many different things, and I never hear it mentioned. The simple concept we learn. In fact, I myself, in my 50 years of public life, have found it incredibly useful in promoting the market economy for public good, for development, for growth. So this is why I puzzle, and maybe you can enlighten. We are not, I'm retired from government. I'm not an active academic. So maybe you can enlighten us about the literature in recent years. Why is this not an issue? So where, for example, one has always made a distinction between market competition as applied to real economy and what one might call financial capitalism. Why? Well, the simple concept which I learned 50 years ago about information asymmetries of externalities arising from information rather than the standard infrastructure kind of stuff which everybody thought is passé and old-fashioned, but it was still relevant to us in developing countries, and moral hazard and such like ideas which are not new. Perhaps when Joe Stiglitz got his Nobel Prize for economics for information theory, at that time maybe it was new to, I don't know, 50% of the public of the world, I don't know. But the fact that these simple ideas which, tell me what government should do, whether it's pollution or it's innovation or R&D, I never hear them. And it's a bit of a puzzle to me. So maybe you can enlighten us on that. So that's the second point. The third point is, yes, I think that that development, in a way, again, being oversimplistic, maybe we went from natural resource economics of Ricardo, where most of his examples were, you remember all that old story about Portuguese wine and something else, to kind of the industrial capital of Smith and the innovation of Schumpeter, right? So, but, and here I'll make a little plug. In EGROW, we have a paper, which people haven't seen it, they really should. It's called India Vision 2050. And in that, one of many core ideas is what I call a digital India and a green India. Okay. So what you are saying, and this connects to some of your later ideas that, and basically it would be very useful if you can, it's quite an easy read. I don't think it's more than 7-10 pages. And if you have specific ideas leading from that, it'd be very useful. Perhaps you can send them to us to Dr. Charan Singh, and he can communicate them to me. This is something we see as a core forward movement in India's development, actually, things which will drive. It's a little more complicated, and I'll connect it in my next point. Well, they are. If you take the digital India, okay, a simple example. In my view, digitization of the economy is partly a substitute for transport, which is energy intensive, and therefore inherently the development of the digital economy will reduce pollution and the kind of things you're talking about and worried about. So it's connected. It's digital India, green India. In that, I also mention, of course, given our labor intensity, we have a lot of recycling of waste. But in that, I also talk about urban design, of designing consumer goods so that they are not all throwaway. That is what I associate with Western capitalism. There's nothing inherent about it. till in my youth and maybe till 10 or 15 years ago, we used to do that routinely. I mean, I'm talking about somebody from an, let's say, roughly an upper middle income family. We never used to throw away anything. Till the last minute, I still remember my grandfather, he would insist, can we repair this thing? Okay, and we were not poor. Okay, so again, this is something which was in our psychology till 15, 20 years ago, and I still unfortunately have it. But whenever I ask anybody, is there somebody can repair it? They say, no, just throw it away. I mean, and to be more concrete, I remember throwing away a whole washing machine and a refrigerator, which pained me, actually. I'm still that old, okay? So again, you know, there are these ideas where I have actually mentioned in that, and as I said, I would love to have your comments on that, where we could be pioneers, because this is not so far away for us. It's something which we did till very recently. If all the youngsters who are probably listening talk to their fathers or grandfathers, they'll hear that this is not something unnatural thing to do. And of course, it saves resources. The more you save of steel or metal or whatever else was in those machines, the less you have to extract from the earth. So that's the third point. Again, these are comments, and I would just like whatever comes into your mind you want to add to this, and 2 or 3 more ones. I guess in a way it's becoming a discussant, but doesn't matter. Treat it, as I said, as you will. Okay, the fourth point, when you look forward to the future, again, you know, I go back, as I said, I'm probably even before your father's or grandfather's age, but the word which comes to mind is dynamic comparative advantage, right? This was a word which was thrown around during our relative youth, or when we came of age, when we were in a position to be heard a little or discussion. And the interesting link is, you know, in a way we have an example which is actually not so good, or which has both positive and negative, is China. They have deliberately used asymmetric trade, technology, FDI, and subsidy policies to change the dynamic comparative advantage of China to its advantage over a period of 30 years. Okay. Now, I don't want to go into details of China here, but the point I want to make to all our listeners, and of course, as I said, you're welcome to comment, is that there is this issue. It is an issue of fairness, which we are faced with, actually. We have been quite sensitive to it for some time. Maybe the rest of the world is maybe just getting there. But linking it to the previous point, I think we are very aware of it, and we do not want to miss the bus. And this is not just, like I said, our EGROW's India Vision 2050, but the government, I think Charan will be able to say more when he comments, India Vision 2047 or something which is being developed, and where EGROW also has written some papers for them, right? You might want to add that. But the point being that we are very conscious of it, and we are definitely on a track where we don't want to miss the bus. The question is how best to do it, how efficiently, etc., etc. Obviously, we don't have unlimited resources. We have to think very carefully about the policies, etc. And finally, well, okay, so that's actually, you know, I have a term, the people have talked about the READ policy, R-E-A-D, of the Chinese, looking forward. Or rather, I call it that. They have a 2035 and a China 20 innovation policy. I call it S-READ. And I'm not a diplomat, so I'm going to be very blunt about it. The S, small s, stands for spy, steal. RE for reverse engineer and develop. Now, the question, so I mean, that's part of what I said about having good parts and bad parts, but I don't think we should forget the bad parts. But I think the democratic countries now are hopefully moving in the positive direction where, you know, they help each other, but they don't steal from each other, you know. So it's a fine balance. In India, we have been saying that invest, it's fine, you know, we are all on board, but give us this investment. We have a plan. we want to be on the frontiers of green technology. I've already given you how we doing it. But you do owe us at least investment. We are not asking for past reparations, and not because you've spoiled the environment for 50 years or 100 years or 1,000 years. That's not what we are talking now. We are saying at least encourage your companies, encourage people to transfer the technology, to invest, transfer. We are not saying just give it. We're not wanting to steal it. Tell your companies to come here and use it. We are not stealing it. Some other country may be doing it, but here we just want the investment. Okay, with that, let me stop, and you can take up any and these issues, and then I'll turn to Charan and others.
Do you want me to reply directly, or you want to collect?
Whatever you want to comment on, and then we'll move on. Whatever you have to say on these points.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I like a lot of what you're saying. I'm very glad that I'm not the only one with a passion for long-term world history. So when you're telling me you're listening to podcasts about 6,000 years of Indian history, this is great. This is my cup of tea. So I'm glad, and that's a bit the approach. Although it's not focused on India, but it's the approach I try to follow in the book, of learning from past experiences, from past civilizations, from past challenges, in order to inform how we're going to address the challenge of the moment. One of your questions was on what governments should do. I mean, part of the answer lies with what you were mentioning already. So this idea that you have externalities, and that climate change has been defined as the biggest externality on the planet, and so that's why economists for a long time, at least since the 1990s, but even before that, have been arguing that you need carbon pricing. And indeed, some governments are moving on that dimension. I can speak of Europe and the European Union having a relatively high carbon pricing, but it's not the only one. There's especially when you look at smaller jurisdictions. Tokyo has one, California has one, Ontario has one. So it's very distributed. And there's a lot more. Then, I mean, governments can also get creative. You can use regulation as a way to increase the shadow price of stuff. So when you say, your electric car can drive through the city center, but your polluting car cannot, you're shifting prices, and you're using regulations to make the green option more palatable, or increase its value to the consumer, and therefore speed up its adoption. And there's a lot more. I mean, because of the fact that the green transition is going to touch on so many aspects of the economy, as I was mentioning before, there are measures that are being taken on the agricultural front to reduce the use of pesticides or of fertilizers. There's measures that are being taken on transport to electrify as much as possible so large public investments, let's say, so to a certain dimension, to electrify transport, public transport, and so on. In part, you use large public investment also to break out of a technological lock-in. So right now, our economy is built for the fossil fuel industry. The fact that you find a gasoline station every kilometer makes it very difficult to get out of this technology and just buy an electric vehicle. And this is obviously just one example, but in that, large public investments can help out, because if you start building electric recharge points, even with public investment, you're helping break out of technological lock-ins, which is why this sort of gives the economic logic as to why these investments make sense in the early phase. It makes sense in the early phase to subsidize some of this stuff. We are subsidizing electric vehicles. You can subsidize renovation work for houses to improve insulation. You can subsidize the installation of solar panels. You can subsidize a lot of stuff in the early stage, but until you reach price parity. So you want to use the tools of government so that these technology become better, and at some point they become the cheapest option, And at that point, you don't even need so much government action any longer. I liked a lot the point you mentioned with, let's say, trying to not throw anything away or trying to fix things as much as possible. You know, Italy developed very fast in the during World War II. The country was destroyed, and then it had effectively 20 to 30 years of China-style growth at the rate of 6%. So let's say my grandparents are a generation that lived in misery, and then very rapidly my parents' generation is a generation that experienced very rapid economic growth, and then the country became wealthy. So I sympathize with a lot of what you say, and indeed I can hear, and these stories resonate with me as well, of the grandparents that would say we wouldn't throw anything away ever. And I think that this is a model towards which we are going to be moving. We use fancy terms these days, so we would call it circular economy. We would ask companies to build in these features into the products. And so make sure that their products are recyclable, or that the materials that they use are recyclable. And again, you can do that with regulation, imposing this. You can make sure that they are disassemblable, so that you can open a product easily and then separate it and recycle what is recyclable as much as possible. You can put in place a so-called product stewardship or extended producer responsibility. So you can ask companies to be responsible for the product. So for example, washing machines, but a lot of home appliances in Europe, for instance, but in many OECD countries in general, let's say companies that produce the good are responsible for its disposal. And so the result is that you have a strong incentive, you're realigning incentives so that the companies have an interest in designing these products so that they can be recycled as much as possible, because if not, they're paying the price of throwing them away. And we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that going forward. So moving to a linear model of you buy, you use, and you throw away, to a model where it's more circular, because you recycle stuff and that produces material for the next good that you're going to use. And finally, I don't have much to say, but I agree a lot with what you were saying in terms of investments and how the relationship between countries that have the financial means and countries like India that might have less of the technology or the financial means, but are great investment opportunities, will receive investment funds. And this is, I think, something that we're going to see more and more of. Because also, I mean, responding to capitalistic type of behaviors. So the fact that it's a large country, it is a growing country, it represents a big market. I think that increasingly Indian consumers as well are going to be focused on changing preferences, of having an interest in not destroying the planet, but having a green option available as well, especially if it's cheaper as well. And so I think that this is going to attract a lot of investment and capital also from abroad. And this is the channel that I envision, more than, in line with what you were saying, large scale type of reparations, that I don't believe is going to be the way forward necessarily on this, not at least on the scale that we need it. And that's it. Thank you very much. You're on mute.
So before I turn to Dr. Charan Singh and Dr. Vishen Das for their brief comments and questions, just one thing I want to mention about carbon pricing. We have had among the highest taxes in the world on diesel and petrol for, I don't know, 70 years or something. But of course, nobody calls it carbon pricing. But I think it's worth noting that when one does these kind of comparisons, that should be kept in mind, because people just don't know about it. I mean, the people who criticize it keep talking about reducing, that they are too high in India. But people outside don't know that we have been carbon pricing for a long, long time. They hear the part which is the subsidies, which is the fertilizer subsidies. They don't hear about the high taxes we've had on petrol and diesel for, as I said, 50 years or 75 years. Anyway, Dr. Charan Singh, any comments or questions? Dr. Vishan Das?
Yeah, I really liked your study, and I was fortunate to have bought the book and read it. And I really like the contents of the book. I would recommend anyone who can afford should buy. I wish you can come out with the India version, and this is costing us 2,300 in India. I wish it could cost us 500-600 if they can come out with the Asia version. That would be good, so that many more people can read it. My students can read it, and people benefit from it. The first thing that I want to mention is Dr. Virmani's comment. I want to further say that in a country like ours, the 5,000 odd years of civilization that we have imbibed surviving with nature. So much so, if you visit India, you will see that many trees are worshipped. Many animals are worshipped. Many plants are worshipped. Many birds are considered vehicles of God and therefore respected. So much so that the three elements which are very important for creation, water is treated like a father, earth like the mother, and air like the guru. And that is the very reason that to a great extent we all take care of the three elements. Now, this thing seems to have been totally forgotten in the Western world, in in the race for, you call it capitalism, or you call it growth, or materialistic possessions. Now, I can't understand how did this happen. So you mentioned about the book on innovation, and I'm going to buy it, read it, and probably invite the author to speak here. But going forward, and that's the question I was asking you, is there is there a possibility that innovations that have been very polluting, say for example air conditioning, all these innovations that have an implication on one of the three elements which I mentioned, earth, water, and air, any innovation which has an implication on these basic elements have to be studied and tested before they are patented. And therefore I can't see, but I can't see happening. But I wish that at the patent level, at the innovation level, there is a barrier, there is a filter which says that this innovation has negative value or will add negatively to the elements, and therefore we will not permit it unless we have a filter at that very stage. For example, we have that filter in vaccines, we have that filter in medicines, we test it, and in case we see anything, we either reject it or we say refine it. Now, in innovation, something like that has not been, at least to my knowledge, not been visible. So I was wondering, how do we make this recommendation so that at the instead of degrowth which you are mentioning, where we slow down, I would say further on, we may not do the degrowth, may not be possible, countries may not accept it, but at least can we apply a brake on innovation? That is one. Secondly, there are now in India, and I'm aware of, and Laurie Baker was one of them, architectural designs of buildings that make sure that the local material used is more climatically better suited to the local areas. And therefore, again, I don't see any drive where the urge to use local material is there. I say this because on high towers, high floor buildings, the need for air conditioning, lighting, office complexes where so much of artificial air movement has to be created for ventilation, all that needs to be revisited. Now, in huge countries with huge geographical areas, it sounds iconic to have cities with multiple buildings, multiple floor buildings, But now, given the situation that we have landed in, should the world not be moving to more flatter buildings and those buildings which are built with the local climatic material? The third, in our own country, we are feeling that filament yarn, fabrics, textiles, which are being imported from the Western world through international agencies like Zara, H&M, and Marks and Spencer. These are probably more akin and useful in cold weather countries. The fabrics don't breathe, but the fabric with which Indians have always come up is a simple khadi or cotton. The fabric breathes itself. So the fashion design, and that surprises me most. I've lived both in Sydney and in Boston and in Palo Alto and in Washington. I do not know the dress code of a necktie and a three-piece suit and a five-piece suit. What sense does it make if you have to push up your AC to 18 degrees by wearing all this? So the fashion industry has also to come and say how they can contribute. So I would like to say and conclude, while your book is very meaningful, it's very timely, but I see that I don't see concrete steps, and I've just illustrated three for you. I don't see concrete steps, and that is why I say I don't see seriousness. While the emerging countries like India are facing the brunt, the Prime Minister of our country goes and tells the world, I assure you that we will meet all the requirements by such and such time. I don't see that seriousness, nor commitments, nor targets by the Western world. And I was wondering, you have written a book. What are you doing, and you are in the European Commission yourself, which is an important policy-making body. What are you doing to push so that these thoughts become a reality? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me, before you, I give you a chance to answer, just want to add two small things. One, definitely what Dr. Charan Singh said about building design is been off and on, but we have mentioned it in our India Vision 2050 also, but he is right that this has kind of disappeared from view. I mean, it doesn't seem to be an international interest in designing buildings according to local. There was a big interest in this in India for a while, but it's kind of gone away, you know. And secondly, just associated with that, I and a co-author have a paper in EPW, which is called Natural Cities, where we try to design, you know, based on our river system, we gave the design of a city, which we call natural city, which would use the environment to design and develop a city. The simple idea there was that if you have a water bank, you can have a self-sustaining city of roughly up to 1 million or so people. I forget the exact population, but we gave a design of that. The point being that I don't think enough uh, innovation or thinking is going into these issues of urban design, including buildings, etc. So just adding to what Dr. Charan is saying, if you have any information on that, perhaps you can comment.
Thanks a lot. Tough questions, but very fair and very interesting. I think the first question, or the first question that I noted down, is to a certain extent why did this happen? How did this happen? How did this happen in the West at some point, or what were they thinking? Let's say in inverted commas at some point. And my impression is that to a certain extent, nature, for good or bad, and we can discuss the reasons, but at some point, nature was perceived as something unlimited, or that, you know, humans were a small share or a small part, or the economy was a small part of planet Earth, and that therefore, yeah, you're affecting the environment, but you're affecting it locally, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, which probably was true in most of human history. So again, it probably comes from and a history where, you know, humanity wasn't that large, our economies weren't that big, and we couldn't surely affect the whole planet's ecosystem at once. But then, of course, we do. We now know that we do, and that we have for the past 100+ years. But that being said, I don't know if what the answer, I mean, my impression is that the answer to this will be to mitigate and manage humanity's let's say interaction with nature. And so I would resist this temptation of saying we just don't want to affect nature at all, because every human activity affects nature effectively. The key is to manage this. So you don't want to destroy the planet, you don't want to destroy the forests and everything, but you need to manage this so that you thrive as a civilization, as a country, as a nation, as a people. But at the same time, you do so without destroying the ecosystems on which most of our well-being depends. So it's also in our own direct interest. And in that, I don't think that the issue there is to put a brake so much on innovation per se, but on a type of innovation. So an innovation that is based or professed on using more raw materials, or using more energy, or using fossil fuels, and so on and so forth. But in the moment in which you're inventing, you're mentioning, for example, architecture, and you're inventing new ways of doing things and buildings, and these new technologies become cheaper, you're actually fostering growth and innovation. Of course, a different type of innovation, but that's fine. And so that's what I would like to see more of. And in this respect, we've already seen some of it. You were mentioning the example of air conditioning, which is interesting to me because, I mean, you've read already in the book, but in a way it links back to the fact that early air conditioners were actually extremely toxic to the planet because they were built using CFCs, and this was harming the ozone layer. And at the end of the day, the way this played out is that new, regulation was put in place. There was the Montreal Protocol, so there was also a global agreement on this. But at the end of the day, we invented new ways of doing air conditioning that didn't have CFCs. Now, the new air conditioners might have other problems, that they're energy intensive, for example, and then you try to solve that. But it is this type of trial and error process that rekindles innovation and effectively growth. One of your questions was on architecture. Of course, I am no expert of architecture, narrowly speaking. I know that there is a strong push to reinvent the ways that we do buildings, because indeed, a lot of the way they were being built up until recently was steel and cement type of buildings, or glass and steel, which tend to be cold during the winter, hot during the summer, and then you have to heat them and basically have them on air conditioning constantly. And new ways of building are being considered that use natural light, that use natural air say sources, so that the building cools on its own, or using water to cool the building, or using new techniques to do that. And if we're talking policy, and that was a bit your question, the initiative of Europe, or the European Commission in this respect, is the European Bauhaus, where a variety of architects, of innovators in this space have been called together to reflect on the future of cities. And so how can you design a city that goes beyond an old model, and instead you're reinventing the way you're doing housing, also in terms of materials. So maybe it's not going to be cement, or mostly cement anymore, and it is going to be, I don't know, wood or something else. But this is something that is surely being explored increasingly. And the same for the fashion industry. I mean, you're mentioning Zara, you're mentioning H&M, and these are companies that have built their model on fast fashion. And so this idea that Primark, that we push prices as low as possible so that people can just buy as much as they want and use and throw away type of model. And I would argue that that model is soon going to be over, in part because of regulation. So regulation is being drafted as we speak as part of the circular economy packages saying, look, companies like Zara, like H&M, like Uniqlo as well, if you want to operate in certain markets, of which the European one is a big one, you need to have some requirements in terms of water use, in terms of the materials you use, in terms of recycling possibilities, and so on and so forth. And I think that we're gonna see a lot more of that, which other side of the medal has implications for a variety of countries that have thrived on this model. Again, I am no expert of it, but to my understanding, Bangladesh owes some of its economic success on a model that is built on being the factory for garments for some of these companies. And of course, this requires a bit of a challenge, but an opportunity as well to reinvent that type of production, because the window, or for other countries not to copy it one-to-one, because that window of opportunity for that type of industry built in that type of way is probably closing and closing fast. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Charan, I don't see Dr. Vishen Das. Is there any other question now? We have about a couple of minutes, 4 minutes. If there's any questions which you think are.
Dr. Vishen Das is there. Dr. Vishen Das.
But he is not visible. He was
not
visible
raised his
earlier.
hand.
He's not.
Yes. I see the question. I think to a great extent he has covered.
May I?
Yeah, Dr. Vishen Das.
Yeah, good evening, sir. Good evening, Chairman. Good evening, CEO Charan Singh. And also, I heard your each word very carefully, and it was delightful to hear you. You made us very knowledgeable after hearing you. One very small thing, in fact, two small questions on agriculture. Now, India is giving a lot of emphasis on organic farming. And what you see the future of fertilizer, that means chemical fertilizer in India and elsewhere, because we are now trying to move away from chemical fertilizer. That is one. And second, somewhere you also said the climate policies and development, there is no trade-off. Does it also imply that some countries are trying to calculate the green GDP? So in the near future, or in the middle or long term, will the green GDP coincide with the GDP?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vishen Das. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will start from the second question because it goes really to the heart of some of my work, which is also on these, let's say, beyond the GDP indicators, or the idea that GDP measures only certain things not so well, and so how can we improve it? And part of this effort is what you're mentioning on green GDP. There's a variety of other indicators as well, some that try to track well-being, some that try to track let's say the HDI of the World Bank. There's many of these indicators, and in a way, I think the short answer to what you were saying is yes, as in I think that they will progressively converge, in part because I think that it is the economy that will be adjusting along the lines that I've presented, and as that happens, it will create also GDP growth. It will create also some co-benefits in terms of improving our relationship to nature, improving air quality, improving a variety of things, improving climate change, hopefully. But I would say that the two will progressively converge. In terms of organic farming, I'm in a tough spot because I'm the son of two biologists who work on some of these issues. My impression is that, but again, of course, I'm no expert of the specificities of that sector. But my impression is that indeed we're going to have to move beyond a model that is based on an extensive use of fertilizers, or at least nitrogen fertilizers produced using methane, and therefore producing CO2 emissions extensively. So that is part of the big chunk of where emissions from agriculture come from. How that happens is to be seen. Some say, you can improve or innovate organic farming to a point where the yields are going to be maintained. Others say, no, that is not going to happen. Innovation will have to progress on, GMO type of techniques, or using new technologies like CRISPR, or some say, it's indoor farming. So I don't know. I'm not a futurist either. So I don't want to tell you these things like by 2050, this is what the world will look like. I'm more an expert of the innovation process per se. And what I can tell you is we clearly have a problem. We clearly, prices of some of, let's say, CO2 emissions will increase. And in the moment in which that happens, different companies will experiment, and different nations will experiment with different techniques to square the circle. So to keep yields high while reducing prices, including of fertilizers. And how this happens then is to be seen, where innovation takes us.
Thank you. Charan, I think we've had a long 1.5 hours already. So if there's any specific question, we will, do you see any specific question? I don't see anything. So
Yes.
with that, let me thank you and all the listeners, that we had a pretty good audience today, actually.
Yes.
And with that, let me hand it over to you, Charan.
Alessio, thank you very much. And I wish we had more authors like you who are writing on this. This is a Herculean task, very difficult to make all the changes. Excessive cooperation would be required within the countries, and I think amongst the private sector too, so that we get innovations and we get, as you mentioned, building material, fashion design, which keeps the environment into account and also ensures that in days to come, in decades to come, we may not go directly for degrowth, but in 15 to 20, 25 years, we are able to achieve by these, I would say, new innovative methods, which are climate friendly, environmental friendly. We lack that, and we wish that people like you in influential places are successful in convincing the policymakers around the world. The recording of today's presentation will be available by noon tomorrow. I'm going to request everyone, as the topic is of concern for all of us and it has intergenerational implications for our children and grandchildren. If we can spread this good word, it will be beneficial for us and next generation. So please use this PowerPoint to spread the word on Twitter and elsewhere so that we are able to raise the concern. I repeatedly feel there is a need at the very entry, a filter at the patent level, and look at the implications and say the air conditioning was one example I gave, but there are many such examples. In the name of modernity, we adopt instruments, technologies, and techniques which add to global warming, which we realize 20 years later. I would also like to say next week, in the same scheme of things, we have Professor Nirvikar Singh from University of California, Santa Cruz, speaking to us on fiscal issues. So I would invite all of you to please spare a time and come and join us and enrich the discussion with your participation. Once again, thanks to our chairman, Dr. Virmani, to have chaired the session today. And thanks to Alessio. I do, many times say I should call him Professor Alessio, but the book that he has written and the way he has gone about and the thoughts that he deserves to be called Professor Alessio. So thank you for Professor Alessio for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.